This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.
Good Wednesday morning, everybody. Clay Ferraro, Ira Winderman here with you on Inside the Paint. And we are here, Ira, to take Heat fans' finger off the panic button a little bit. Or I don't know, maybe Ira has a different plan. Maybe he's going to
or not.
Much like we asked you guys to pound the smash the like button, Ira wants to smash the panic button on what we're seeing with the Miami Heat right now. But, as Ira mentioned during the crossover, they've lost 3 out of their last 5. And yet there are certainly some things that you look at, the most glaring being the fact that you played the other night without both Jimmy Butler and Tyler Hero. That, okay, let's take a step back and what can we take out of some of these games that might be a little bit of a concern versus what is just kind of an 82-game schedule and you take it as it comes.
Well, I think it's a couple of things. Clay, you're totally right. When your team is not whole, you have no read on your team. And when you have players out who are duplicate in positions and styles, for example, Jimmy Butler and Tyler Hero, all of a sudden that offensive creativity is out of the mix also. Clearly, Jimmy's lack of defensive perimeter, who wasn't in the game, that hurt against Denver as they went for 120 points. That's a concern. But that's what the regular season is versus the playoffs. It's navigating these kind of things. Mm-hmm. I just posted a story at sunsentinel.com. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, COVID is back. It's impacting all sports. We've seen in the NHL, the Islanders this week had to cancel a full week's worth of games. LeBron James now in health and safety protocols. The Heat are going to play the Pacers on Friday. Justin Holiday now in health and safety protocols. It's going to happen. There's going to be a Heat player, unfortunately, who even just because of a breakthrough infection, they've received their boosters, I just wrote about that at sunsentinel.com, are going to miss some time. So you have to say to yourself, how do we have that covered? I think what Big O said when he did our crosstalk makes sense, that they are developing enough depth right now, whether it's a Gabe Vincent or a Max Strus, where they can fill in spot minutes here or there and still survive against lesser teams, not against the level of a Denver Nuggets, maybe tonight, even though they're surprising a little bit against the level of the Cleveland Cavaliers. But you still want to get a read on a team that's being whole. And Clay, something I thought about this morning, because I know we're going to get into the Denver Nuggets game and the non-rematch and all that. You're talking about someone like Markieff Morris tonight will miss his 12th straight game with that whiplash. And unfortunately, it led me to go to MayoClinic.com and ClevelandClinic.com. And it's not good. Because what they say about whiplash is the effects can last 3 months or longer. Now, that doesn't mean it prevents you from playing NBA basketball. But, Clay, what it means is this Heat team has not been whole, at least since that November 8th game in Denver, and likely won't be for a while either. So you're just trying to survive. I think where the Heat are in the East, where the Heat are in the NBA is good enough as long as they don't have a misstep. You don't want to lose at home. You don't want to lose to the Denver Nuggets. That's one thing. If you lose at home to the Cleveland Cavaliers tonight, that's another thing.
Make sure to drop your questions, your comments in the chat. We like to get to that. We like to make this as interactive as possible. So, Ira, I'm looking at the standings in the Eastern Conference right here. And, one thing that you notice is you've got 5 teams at the top that all have 6 or 8 losses. Brooklyn right there at the top of 6, the Heat with 8. And then you got 3 other teams, the Bulls, the Wizards, and the Bucks, all with 8 losses, right? So this whole thing is jumbled at the top. And yet you look at the top 6 seeds, and every team that is up there, the Heat's beaten all of those teams, and many of them when they were at least somewhat whole. In other words, you've got your guys on the floor. So, if you're stepping back and you're looking at the big picture of this thing, and we actually talked about this last week, that we were looking ahead to that Chicago game because it was another one of those measuring stick games where you're looking at this team and, okay, how do you match up against the teams that are the contenders in the Eastern Conference, your Brooklyns, your Milwaukees of the world, and the teams that are kind of those chic teams that are making a climb to the top, your Charlotte, your Chicago's. And the Heat have stepped up every single time that they played those teams. And they did it again over the weekend in Chicago. Now, again, you mentioned this before that game, too. It was the second night of a back-to-back for the Bulls. And yet, you can only play what the schedule says you're supposed to play. So, broad view here, nothing to panic about. The only thing I would say that, I don't want to call it a concern, but it's something that we talked about before the season, Ira, is you do have a team full of older guys. And so it's not going to get better. And you mentioned the COVID situation. Like, that's going to happen, but it's also going to coincide with the fact that you're going to have to try to find some rest days for some of these older guys as you get towards the end of this season.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. If you're going to
get towards the playoffs. So bottom line, they're navigating it. They're right where they need to be. Yeah, they're right where they need to be, Ira, and yet at the same time, you also understand that there's going to be more surviving along the way. So I'm not panicking. It was frustrating that, and I want to get into that Denver game now. It was frustrating that you couldn't get the measure of revenge, I guess, that we've been talking about for a while. And yet at the same time, you got to keep the big picture in perspective, and it's not worth throwing a Tyler Hero out there if he's not feeling right, putting a Jimmy Butler out there if he's not feeling right. Make sure that you don't do more damage and cause these guys to miss more time long term.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting. We've spoken about, can the Heat survive without player X, player Y, or player Z? And we've spoken about, at the start of the season, the two deep, that if you don't have Bam, at least you have Dwayne Dedmon. Mm-hmm. If you don't have PJ Tucker, at least you have or had Markieff Morris. If you don't have Jimmy Butler, you can move Tyler Hero into the starting lineup. If you don't have Duncan Robinson, or even if you do have Duncan Robinson, you can play Max Strus there instead. Our concern was if you don't have Kyle Lowry. Now, I'm not saying that Gabe Vincent is the full answer. I'm not saying there's enough body of work right there to instill full confidence, but you're gaining confidence that when Kyle Lowry goes out of the game, that Gabe Vincent can give you something. So that is the encouraging part.
So let me just because I want to say on Gabe Vincent really quickly, and you jog my mind, not to interrupt you, but I am interrupting you. What I think we're seeing with Gabe Vincent really quickly, Ira, to me, it's less that he's a Kyle Lowry replacement. It's more that when he's on, he's closer to a Tyler Hero replacement. And this is what you've said from the beginning, Ira, that Gabe Vincent, you don't want him to be your pure point guard.
Yes.
What he can do when Gabe Vincent is at his best, he's a bucket. And we saw that in Chicago, man. I mean, 16 points in the fourth quarter of that game. They don't win that game without him performing that way. So in some ways, you're right. It's really encouraging. At the same time, I think it backs up what you've been saying all along, and I'll let you kind of take this, that Gabe Vincent is, at his best, a really good scorer, but you're still missing that Kyle Lowry replacement. And also, when Jimmy Butler's out like he was against Denver, you're missing that extra facilitator.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You can do your workarounds. You can't afford Kyle and Jimmy to be out at the same time. We've had all kinds of different combinations to this point. Also, and I'm sure we'll get into this at some point also, it's almost like you've got to get Bam away from that playmaker role so he can be more aggressive, which he was at the start of the season when Kyle was there all the time, was playing big minutes also. So look, this is a tightrope that we know Eric Spoelstra's on. We've spoken ad nauseum, 13 of the first 20 on the road. The crazy part about it, and we spoke about this last week on our Pallet Rock City Inside the Paint, is that after tonight's game against Cleveland, 13 of the next 20 are on the road. It's really hard to get relief and rest for players because there's one thing about being at home, sleeping in your own bed, resting in a familiar situation. It's not rest when you're on the road. It's not rest when you're flying late after a game and getting to the next city at 4 a.m. It's not rest when you're on a normal human being-sized bed in a hotel room versus your California King or whatever you've constructed in your South Beach Palace. So that's a little bit of the difference. So they really don't have that chance for rest. They have this hellacious road trip coming up at the end of the month that somehow starts in Houston and San Antonio, goes to the West Coast and ends in Atlanta. So, I mean, Eric Spoelstra is really just going to have to do all he can. And again, and I know I get tangential and you bring it back so well as Mr. TV host, but also the problem is the back end of this roster, that you have 4 or 5 unusable, unplayable, not playable players here. Victor Oladipo, we're still waiting. Marcus Garrett in the G League getting seasoning. Udonis Haslem break open in case of emergency. KZ Okpala, has anyone seen him? Is he on a milk carton right now? And Omar Yurtseven, who's clearly not ready. That's the problem, Clay, is you're talking about a full third of your roster are not plug and play. The Heat have done a very good job getting to 10 or 11 deep right now. But in these crazy times, believe it or not, sometimes you need even more than that.
You know, and you talk about bringing it back, and I do want to talk about, this upcoming schedule, and we do this a lot because we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page moving forward. Look, Cleveland tonight, it's a team that, Evan Mobley's back. and they went out there and they just won at Dallas. I think their only loss recently was against Phoenix. I mean, that's a team that's a real problem, and it's a team that I think, Ira, it's similar in some ways, I think, to Charlotte. Now, nobody plays at the pace that they do, but it's a team that's young. And then the guys that aren't necessarily young, you got somebody like Ricky Rubio, who's made such a big difference for them, and is going to come in and he's going to push the pace. So, Ira, to your point, if you're looking for breaks in the schedule, Cleveland ain't it. And we thought that it was before the season, because not just are they playing well, but they're also going to play that really fast up-tempo style. And yes, the Heat do like to play that with Kyle Lowry, and yet it ain't rest. And this is a group that, man, if you're looking for those breaks in the schedule, not only is this going to be a tough game coming up tonight, but it's also a team that kind of plays counter to what you want if you're hoping to get a little bit of a break.
Yeah, but you know what, Clay? It reminds me almost of exactly a week ago when they played in Minnesota. Look, the Timberwolves are for real. They were winning before the Heat played them. They've been winning since the Heat played them. But if that level of team, no offense to Karl Anthony Towns and what they've done there with their roster, and certainly Anthony Edwards, but if that level of a team is going to be a concern point every time, then you are not who you thought you are or who we think you are. That you have to find a way. This has always been sort of better as a whole, a cohesive unit. The Cavaliers are still working in Jarrett Allen. They're still working in Ricky Rubio. They're still working in Evan Mobley. They're still working in Larry Markkinen. They're still working in their players to see if they could be cohesive. The thought of the Heat at the start of the season, everyone was saying, is like, wow, they have a lot of new players, but they've really meshed. They really know who they are.
Right.
I'd like to see them get back to that. I'd like to see them have such a strong identity and sense of 5 men on a string defensively, of everyone playing their roles offensively, that yes, you might argue the other team is younger, is more talented, is more athletic, but it's the cohesion of the Heat. The injuries have prevented that to this point. I mean, look at tonight's injury report. We don't know about Jimmy Butler with the tailbone, an injury that could take typically 3 weeks to heal. We don't know about Bam right now with the thumb sprain, when we were all concerned about the knee until this point. Tyler Hero looks like, based on Art Basel and everything in town and him being out and about, that he's fine again. But until you have all the pieces together, you might not be better than an individual. In Minnesota, the individual, let's face it, Anthony Edwards beat you. Tonight, there are going to be 2 or 3 individuals on that court for Cleveland who could beat you. So can the Heat regain the continuity and the cohesion they had?
Yeah, and that's where you're hoping Bam can play. Because, I mean, one of the guys who can beat you is Evan Mobley. And I don't know about you, but I've been extremely impressed with him. Really quickly, you mentioned the injury report. I want to go through these before the break. Can you run through what you're hearing, what you're seeing, what your vibe is on some of these? Jimmy Butler, Tyler Hero, we saw him out at Art Basel. And look, I don't think it's that Tyler Hero necessarily could not have played. It's that there's no reason to roll him out there if something's not right, if he's not feeling right. And you know Tyler Hero wants to play. But again, we're in November, and now we're in December. But
and you're constantly measuring. Jimmy could play. You know what we always say, Clay? If this was a playoff game, would the player play?
And that's where I want to go.
If this is a playoff game, Jimmy Butler plays. If this is a playoff game, Dwayne Dedmon plays. If this is a playoff game, Bam Adebayo plays. But you're also looking for breaks on schedule. You're also looking at your upcoming schedule. Does a game against Indiana on Friday carry more value because of tiebreaker? If you wind up in the conference game, tiebreaker, something like that. Milwaukee, second night of a back-to-back. Are you going on the strip? Eric Spoelstra will never say this, saying, let's just get a split. So in other words, are you all in on Indiana and whatever happens on the second night of Milwaukee? I mean, Eric Spoelstra, no, we play every game. I get it. That's what coaches say also. Nothing on the injury report is dire. Jimmy Butler has a bruised tailbone. Well, you can pad him up and heat him up and, do what you can and get him for the games you need.
But at what cost, right? And that's the question. At what cost?
Well, that to me is not an injury that you exacerbate. Okay. So I guess what I'd say on all of these, as far as we know, nothing here can get exacerbated to be worse. We don't think. I don't know about Bam's thumb, but let's face it, right here, Clay. If Bam's thumb was that bad, he wouldn't have continued in that game. They certainly wouldn't have been that foolish. So I think that's the good thing. It's not a case of, like in the finals 2 years ago in 2020, when Goran tried to roll out there, with half a plantar fascia, and Bam was pushing his way through after Myers Leonard had to start for them. Nothing that dire. But I know Big O's spoken about this on his show also. The Heat are just not the team to rest a guy and put him in mothballs for 2 weeks. They respect the season. They respect the schedule. They respect the teammates so much. So I would say it this way. Tonight, I would expect Bam to play because he's played through the knee. I'd expect Dwayne Dedmon to play because he's been listed with groin and other things. He's played through it. I think Jimmy can play, but I think Jimmy, I don't want to say it's vanity. If he feels he's not going to be fully Jimmy, might pull back a little bit. So the question tonight against the Cavaliers can be, can you beat that Cleveland team without Jimmy Butler? I think that's where my injury concern rests right now.
So we're gonna keep an eye on that throughout the day, and make sure to follow Ira Winderman on Twitter. He'll keep you up to date. I'll keep you up to date as well. So coming up after the break, though, Ira, I want to go Duncan Robinson, and how concerned are we based on what we're seeing? There were a couple of games where it felt like he was getting out of this thing a little bit, and yet he reverts back. And Ira, I want to kind of get your feel, because you followed the team on the road trip. What's the vibe about Duncan Robinson? Is there concern within the organization? And at what point would you consider giving more of his minutes to someone like a Max Strus moving forward? We're getting to that and a lot more right here on Inside the Paint after the break. I'm about to have to upgrade my internet from Xfinity if this thing doesn't start working again here. We're going off of LTE here on Inside the Paint.
I've been there, and I think Orlando is being there right now. And Clay, as bad as you might think it is at home, and look, I've dealt with all the providers, and if you can even get them to answer the phone, it'd be nice. There is no worse feeling than rushing into a hotel room, signing up for the internet there, and having no idea what's going on. And it used to be you'd have Ethernet cords in hotels that are not wired that way. And it's so up and down half the time. You might remember this. You're a little older. Remember Max Headroom?
Yeah.
And so and it was okay to be like that with your head going back and forth.
The new Coke.
That's what I feel like on the road half the time. Remember, Clay, there is the call-in line. I've had to resort to that. So it might just be my pretty face here for the final 45. But good luck with your cable and your internet.
Yeah, I think the LTE we're good to go. And by the way, Xfinity usually works really well. I'm just not sure what the issue is today. So, Ira, before the break, we were talking about Duncan Robinson, and I want to get into not just Duncan, but some other Heat players that may not quite be living up to what we were hoping for. Duncan being first and foremost. I want to talk about Bam a little bit as well, because I think those are two very, very different stories, guys who are falling short for very different reasons. But let's start with Duncan. What is the level of concern within the organization about these struggles that he's going through? Because he's certainly had a couple of games where, the game in Utah in particular, where he went out there, they don't win that game if he doesn't catch fire. But most of the time this year, it's been a disappointment. So what's the level of concern within the organization about Duncan, and can he get right?
Well, if you're asking what's the public level of concern, none, because that's just how they operate. This is not a negative coaching staff. They will always accentuate the positive. If it's a concern, that'll be handled privately on the practice court. Look, before the last game against Denver, he made 9 3-pointers in his previous 2 games. So even if the percentage was down, he was still a threat. But it's undeniable now. And Clay, when I did that story for SunSentinel.com yesterday, I first went to the NBA stat site and I clicked on the button total 3-pointers. And he was tied for 8th in the league. That makes you a threat. And then I hit the percentage button. I never, in my wildest dream, thought I'd have to scroll down 2 pages to see where Duncan Robinson was when it came to shooting percentage, that he was like 116th in the league. So don't kid yourself. If I'm a quality defender and I'm cheating toward Duncan Robinson because of what he once was, I have all the stats when I go into the game. And I'm saying to myself, okay, this guy's a 32% 3-point shooter. Show it to me. I might not double off Jimmy if he plays. I might not double off Bam Adebayo as much if he has the ball in the paint. So, yeah, I think it's a real concern because this is a league that operates on scouting reports. And right now, opponents are not as threatened by Duncan Robinson. He needs those breakout moments that even if the percentage just goes to 34, 35, 37%, at least on the scouting report, it said made 42% of threes in last game, was 6 of 9 in previous game. Keep an eye out. So, yeah, Duncan needs one of those statement moments, no matter what the Heat say, because he's all about gravity. He's all about drawing opponents' eyes, attention, and extra bodies to make the offense work. And you're going to reach a point where you and I can talk about, he has the history. There'll be a regression upward toward the mean, and that's well and good, but it has to happen at some point. And Clay, as you know, because you watch almost every minute of the games just like I do, even though they play half the time when the Panthers are on also, is some of the misses have been really bad.
Yeah.
And that's a concern.
Yeah, and the form sometimes looks off. I mean, he definitely looks like he's overthinking this thing. And look, I'm not going to sit here and play amateur psychologist, but I do think the new basketball does play a role here. And we've talked about this before on the show. And it's not just him. There are other shooters who have struggled. And yet, look at who the 2 players of the week were this past week in the NBA. It's 2 guys who had been struggling a little bit, Devin Booker and Trey Young, early in the season. Struggles early in the season. They seem to have figured, so whatever it is with the ball, it seems like some other guys are getting over this. There have been a couple of games where it looks like Duncan, if that is part of the issue, has started to get over it. And then you get the 1 out of 9 against Denver. So I think tonight's big for him. And again, you know, we talked about this in the crossover. This is such an overreaction society now. I don't think it's an overreaction to say Duncan needs to see the ball go in the rim, go in the hoop a few times. And because it's just a shooter, man, it's just such a, everything is so, it's a mental game. It's also repetition. It's, man, when you shoot, I'm not good, but like you can kind of feel it when you get going, you see the ball go through the hoop. I can only imagine what that's like for an NBA player when you get the expected result versus when you don't, and you start to doubt yourself and you start to change up what you're doing.
And here's the thing is his numbers are so different road and home. Mm-hmm. He's been Duncan Robinson pretty much on the road. He's been very poor at home on his threes. And I think what happens, Clay, is this. The home crowd, when Duncan used to line up for a 3, would be like, oh, and they're ready for a celebration. Yeah. Now you can almost hear it if you listen to the arena. Duncan's there wide open with a 3, and everyone's like, and there's almost tangible doubt in the air, even with all of us with our masks on. And I think that does impact Duncan. I think he literally is, to use Mike Miller's parlance, letting it fly on the road. I think at home he's overthinking it because he can sense the vibe in that building. It's one thing if you let down the road fans, the few who might travel to road games. It's another when you let down the home fans and you hear that audible groan when he misses his 3-pointers at home. Tonight, that's another reason why he needs a big game, to sort of win back those home fans and have a good feeling in this building for when the schedule finally does turn and the Heat are playing home games, that he can feel better about himself. It's really weird at home. It used to be every single home game, they'd run a play for Duncan to start the game, he'd make his first shot at 3-pointer, and they were off to the races. Now it's like, maybe you want to go in a different direction.
Yeah, and so I think the thing with Duncan, too, it's, and this isn't giving away company secrets here, you ain't paying him to play defense. You're not paying to create for somebody else. So I'm not going to go as far as to say he has one job, but the one job is the reason why they paid him nearly $100 million. And when he's not doing that, he becomes an extreme liability on the floor. He's making up for the other stuff that he doesn't do quite as well with the one thing that he does better than save 2 or 3 players in the NBA when he is on. So if he's not doing that, Ira, at what point do you start to look more at Max Strus? And we've seen Eric Spoelstra in games. I can think of 2 specifically, the Charlotte game earlier in the year, and then one game, the other, maybe the Minnesota game, whatever it was, where Max Strus got a lot of Duncan Robinson's minutes.
Yes.
At what point do you start to look to doing that more permanently? Not that you're going to start Strus, but we all know it's not about who starts, it's about who finishes. At what point do you start to work Strus in even more than you have?
Well, it's Strus, I think, and to a degree, it's Caleb Martin also for this reason defensively, that it's hard to finish games with both Duncan Robinson and Tyler Hero on the floor when Tyler Hero does come back. So you have that element to the equation. But you're totally right. Look, they did not lose the Denver game because of offense. They scored 111 points. I know a bunch came during garbage time, but it was an offensive loss, but it wasn't a loss due to the offense. It was due to the defense.
Offensive, not offensive.
And you know what? I'm going to put you on the spot here. And I know it's hard to think of this through while you're smiling at the camera and doing radio also, but who on the Miami Heat is a worse defensive player than Duncan Robinson? You're on the clock, Clay Ferraro, Local 10, go.
Omer Yurtseven.
Okay. Who's a worse perimeter defender for the Heat than Duncan Robinson?
There isn't. I mean,
maybe
guess
Tyler.
maybe Tyler, and yet I think we've seen him improve in that area a bit. I think he's somebody, and we've talked about this a bit, but I think the exercise has really helped him. But no, there is nobody who is like you can point at and say that guy is definitely worse. And so to your point, Ira, when you lose a game because of your defense, and the guy who's supposed to be making shots on offense goes 1 of 9, and his defense is always going to be what it is, then you need to look for a way to make up the loss on offense. And if that's not going to be with more offense with Strus, that's where Caleb Martin really does come in. And he's been a revelation this year for the team. So if you want to make the lineup a little different and go more defensive, especially when you're missing a guy like a Jimmy Butler, Caleb Martin can do that for you. He can add that element of defense. So I think it's a really good point.
Clay, I have one other point I just want to bring up here, not to interrupt, though we like to interrupt. Because this is what we do on the show. It's called Conversation, is this. Can the Miami Heat get to where they want to go without Duncan Robinson? In other words, you gave me a bunch of scenarios, how Max Strus can hit threes and defend, how Caleb Martin's more of an all-around player. In the moment, I agree with you. In a fourth quarter tonight, if Duncan Robinson is 1 of 6 on threes or something like that, and you text me and you saying, damn it, why aren't they putting Strus or Martin in the game? I would agree with you at that moment. But look at the rest of this roster, okay? If there was no Duncan Robinson, if he was not available, could the Miami Heat still get to where they want to get? Because when you start reducing the confidence, reducing the playing time, reducing the opportunity to get out of the slump, then you're sort of heading or trending in that direction. So can the Miami Heat, if you see them as an Eastern Conference finalist, if you see them as getting to the NBA Finals, can they be that team knowing what you know about the rest of this roster? Maybe the name we always mention once a week, Victor Oladipo, changes that thinking. Can they get to where they want to be without Duncan Robinson being Duncan Robinson?
Can they? Yes, but they would have to reinvent themselves a little bit along the way. I mean, there's no doubt that the lanes open up for Jimmy Butler and Kyle Lowry and even Bam when he's attacking the basket more, because you've got the gravity of Duncan Robinson, of guys going towards Duncan Robinson, and you got PJ Tucker in the corner. So you're pulling defenses apart both at whatever corner PJ Tucker is at and wherever Duncan Robinson is. So I think right now, and this gets back to your original point, I don't know how much more gravity Duncan Robinson pulls than a Max Strus if Duncan continues down this path. Like before, and you mentioned the scouting report, like it's bodies flying towards Duncan Robinson.
Correct.
It's everybody's got their head turned to make sure that the guy who's his primary responsibility, if he's not there, then somebody's going to have to go out and account for Duncan Robinson. So, like, your eyes aren't necessarily in the right place. You hear that a lot in football, that if you're on defense and your eyes aren't in the right spot, you're going to get beat somewhere else. So it opens it up for easy buckets. If you're not that worried about Duncan Robinson, and we're not there yet, but we might be getting to that point, then you're going to have to look for a way to reinvent yourself. So do I think they can? Yes. Do I think it would be hard? Yes. I think the path of least resistance is keep working through this with Duncan. But at some point, you do have to kind of reassess. And hopefully this isn't something that's permanent. Hopefully this is just a quarter pole of the season. If that, maybe this is just a blip, and the next 20 games or so, we'll see something completely different.
And you know what, Clay? And I've had a bunch of readers, and you could see it in my comments on Twitter also. They point out to the bad contracts that were never recoverable. They point to the Tyler Johnson contract. They point to the Dion Waiters contract. They point to the James Johnson, hero of last night's Nets victory over the Knicks contract.
That's right.
The Hassan contract to a degree also. I think Duncan Robinson has a little different comportment. I think Duncan Robinson is the guy who will do every last thing he can to shake himself out. I think guys like James Johnson got comfortable. I think a guy like Dion Waiters got comfortable when it came to his conditioning, at least. I think a guy like Tyler Johnson, probably at the end of the day, was overpaid the way that contract was structured. I don't think this is in any way, and this really pisses me off. We always go back to
I know where you're going with this, and I was about to say the same thing.
Always go back to the money. And I understand in a salary cap league, you have to. You only have X amount of dollars, X amount under the luxury tax. This is not a guy getting fat on, I've got $90 million. Now I'm going to do my podcast and push my donuts and things like that. That's not who this guy is. I have seen guys who that is. They've got paid and they're done. They had their moment. It's hard. NBA work is hard. It might not be as hard as construction or being a fireman or something like that, but if you are dedicated to your craft, it is hours and hours and hours of sweat equity. I guarantee you that Duncan Robinson has doubled down during this time period, and at no time has said, I am set for life, baby. It's not who he is.
The podcast thing bugs me. And so you mentioned something like this because you had a conversation with Tyler Hero about something similar. This was a ways back. And you said, look, I want to let you know what I meant by this. So I'm going to bring back what you said, that it's not that people were questioning whether Tyler was putting in the work last year or saying he was not. It was right. When you are doing all of these extra things, there becomes an extra layer of scrutiny and almost an extra level of responsibility, because if you don't perform and you're doing all these other things, then people are going to naturally question, why are you not performing at that level? It just a coincidence that you just got the contract, that you're doing podcasts, that you're now getting some sponsorships. That doesn't mean that you are not putting in the work. It's unfortunate that people do start to point as some sort of factor, but it's also the nature of the beast here. And the only way, Ira, that you get people to stop saying anything is make the basket. Yeah. I mean, it's that simple.
Tyler did. Like Tyler did at the start of the season from the preseason forward.
We haven't heard anything about that.
Yes.
Nothing. Nobody's making fun of Tyler's Chipotle bowls anymore, or the Tyler cereal,
or his outfits or anything, because he's meeting the on-court expectations and you go forward. And that's just the way it is in this league. Duncan is disappointed a lot. Duncan has the support of all his teammates. And I got to tell you, Clay, I have been in scenarios with players where players, at least if not publicly on the side, have told me, this guy's not putting in the work. This guy has stopped. This guy has regressed. I have heard none of that. You can go through the entire 16-player roster. There is no one who's going to tell you, man, Dunk is letting us down. They might joke about it. They might kid about it, but they see the work that's going on. And you know what? If the work stopped, someone like UD would be up and in his face and making sure the work didn't stop. That's not part of this. He's just missing. It's like, it's like a golfer having the yips. For whatever reason, it's not that the effort's not there, it's that he's just going through something. You can go through something for a week or 2 weeks, or honestly, now it's been a month, but it can't be 2 or 3 months. And it can't be at the biggest moments of truth.
Let me ask you this, Ira, because you see this a lot in the NFL with quarterbacks, and really it's more in college football, where you have a young quarterback, and I'm not saying Duncan Young, but you have a young player who is going through some of these things and kind of overthinking it and not just letting it rip. Is there a point where you say it benefits him a little bit to just let him sit out a little bit and let him kind of view things? Or is it better to let it? I'm not saying you bench him for a game, but at what point do you say, okay, take a step back? You're grinding too hard almost, and you kind of reach that point of diminishing returns.
No, I don't, for this reason, Clay, and don't take this the wrong way. He was 1 of 9 his last game. If he doesn't play tonight, he's still 1 of 9 his last game. And that's still true. What I'm going back to. Shooters have to shoot their way out. Now, it could be like a baseball player. You try to slap hit the opposite way. You try to lay down a bunt. You get some easy ones. Kyle said that. Kyle Lowry after the last game said that. Maybe we need to put him in more optimal positions. Although it sure seems like he's getting a bunch of wide open threes also anyway. But maybe they need to create a couple of bunnies, a couple of easier ones. The risk you take with that is when you focus on him and you create the really easy ones, if those don't go in also, then I don't know. What do you do next?
If he misses a layup, it's over. It's over.
If he can't bunt for the hint, if he can't be like Ichiro and go the opposite direction with the slap hit or something. So I think you just got to keep it going. You've got to sort of downplay it. You got to hope that, water finds its level or not, and just sort of go through that while everyone else contributes.
So I want to talk about Bam in the same vein coming up after the break, but I want to put you on the spot because you said something that kind of triggered something with me. I want a little story time with Ira. I know you can't give us specific names or anything like that, but you mentioned that you've had guys pull you aside at practice and say this guy isn't pulling his weight, he's not working as hard, whatever. Just over this break, kind of think of some of the cooler stories or some of the stories that might make our viewers right now kind of like take a step back.
You know what? I'll even name names, so don't you go anywhere, folks.
That's why we love Ira Winderman right here on Inside the Paint. Ira Winderman is sitting down to give us some stories of the past. And Ira, so I want to get into Bam Adebayo and kind of your thoughts on what he's going through in a minute. But you mentioned something before the break about how Duncan Robinson is one of those guys who, he has a different makeup than perhaps some players in the past who may have gotten a little fat and happy and kind of rested on their laurels after getting a big contract. But you said that you've had players pull you aside, people pull you aside at practices, off to the side, maybe at games, and say, hey, this guy, he's not pulling his weight anymore. So what can you tell us? Give us a story time with Ira here.
Well, I mean, the ultimate story is, and I think he's grown out of this, and I spoke to you about this after the Heat played Utah a couple of times this year. Hassan Whiteside drove teammates to distraction. He was so caught up in statistics and numbers that there would be times after losses when he would get a box score and start reading off his numbers and how he was plus this or had this many rebounds or had this many points. And I can't tell you that teammates had looks in their eyes that if they could and the media weren't there, they would have charged across the locker room and done something or said something. I mean, it got to the point where players went to management and were like, come on, you got to do something in the locker room about it. He grew to a degree, but I do think that very much led to his Miami Heat demise. It became intolerable in the locker room. He put in the work, but he never fully understood what it took. Maybe since going to Portland and Sacramento and now Utah, he seems to have gotten it a little bit more. Back in the early years of the Heat, and these guys are both actually under contract and have stayed in the organization all these years. Glenn Rice was similar to that, and he would look over the box score and talk about if only I got a few more shots. And you remember Keith Askins, right?
Oh yeah,
from when he was at the Heat. Now he's their scouting director. He had to be almost restrained from going after Glenn in the locker room when after a loss, Glenn was talking about getting more shots. He was a guy who annoyed teammates with things like that. They weren't winning. He figured he might as well get his points. And Ronnie Cycli was like that also to a degree. He loved him some numbers. And there was a game against, I believe it was Washington, and I think it might still be the team record. I think he had something like 32 rebounds. And I think he wanted to go for a 40 burger. And Kevin Lockery was so sick of it that he, to this day, I believe, he never told me this, purposely pulled Ronnie out of the game just to stop him from getting more rebounds, which sort of runs contrary to everything you hear. So that's the difference. You never hear Duncan Robinson saying, if I would have gotten more shots, I could have gotten 10, 11, 12 threes in that game. You don't hear that. He still wants to be selfless. He's still looking for the give and go bounce pass to Bam, and that's the difference. He doesn't talk about his shots. He talks about team type things. That's how you keep your teammates. That's how you keep a strong locker room. I don't know if there's any guy in this locker room, honestly, who if you were next to after a game would look at the box score intentionally, unless, and I've seen this, and this is a good thing. I've seen Kyle do this. I've seen Jimmy do this. I've seen Bam do this. Look at the turnovers.
Yes.
Look at the negative. Look what he couldn't. And you'll see a guy like that. I might not have noticed after the game. And I might say, hey, you got a double-double tonight, and you also got 7 assists. And they'll look at the box score, and they'll go, but yeah, I got 5 turnovers also. Bam said it the other day. That can happen. Those are the guys you want on your side.
Do you have any Michael Beasley stories? Anything that you can share? Anything?
No, it's just that Michael Beasley was just wired differently. So you would have this hellacious loss, just this sort of, heartbreaking last-second shot, and he'd be singing in the locker room after the game. He just, however he was wired, however, his brain functioned or whatever, and that bothered teammates also. But it was never malicious.
Never malicious, right.
He was just a silly person. As a matter of fact, I'll give you sort of the examples. 2 of the silliest people to ever be in the Heat locker room were Michael Beasley and Shaquille O'Neal. But when you're winning and you're producing and you choose to sumo wrestle your teammates naked in the locker room, no one's going to say anything, except maybe if you had to look directly at it, because the guy is producing and the guy is winning. That's the difference. Michael Beasley never reached that level of success as a team. Honestly, individual success also after his rookie season, certainly not what he did at Kansas State. So that's the difference. You can be silly and frivolous. You can be annoying. I think Jimmy Butler has a bunch of annoying in him. Remember the game he sat out and he was Instagramming how all his teammates stunk?
Yeah.
How could you miss that, Max? Kyle, terrible pass.
Yeah.
Because you're a winning player who has done it. So that's the difference. It's the guys who haven't gotten there, who haven't been deep in the playoffs. Those are the annoying guys.
And by the way, you notice with Jimmy, he only does that when they win. Like, he's not going to do that.
Right. He's smart enough not to take those moments on the crushing moments where teammates are coming in the locker room and they're looking at their phones. They can't believe what they did. And one of their teammates is sitting there with an Instagram post saying, "You stink." Yeah, he's smart enough with that.
So let me ask you this about...
Well, I don't know exactly what you're asking, but I think basically as you sort of regain your internet there, we were going to talk about Bam Adebayo and what he's done to this point. So I'm assuming the conversation is about Bam. Am I correct? Did I read you right?
No, I think we're back. I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you about Michael Beasley really quickly, and this is something that I had heard a while back. So confirm this if you can, or deny this if you can. I have no knowledge this actually happened, but there was a point where he had not been playing very much, and he ended up. There was a point where he wasn't expecting to play. And this was back in the day when pregame reporters were allowed to be in locker rooms before COVID, obviously. And he came in and he was in the starting lineup. And somebody mentioned it to him that, hey, how does it feel to be, back playing again, back starting? And he looked at the reporter like, wait, what? I'm playing? Yeah. Like, what? Like, that he didn't know. Did that actually happen? I didn't know if that
that's happened to a bunch of guys, because the one thing when Eric Spoelstra sometimes tells us, I don't know, or I'm still formulating, a lot of times there's an amount of desperation to that, Clay, where it comes to the last minute. It's like, oh, I've got to start this guy. And the difference with the Heat is why they want to know is this, and we don't see this. There are brutal 2-on-2, sometimes 3-on-3 practice court games up there, where Udonis Haslem is insisting that the Omer Yurtsevins and the Kaziak Palas work their butt off before the game, most likely with the assumption they're not going to play that game. So those are ongoing. We don't see it get to the arena early. You might even say to yourself, hey, why isn't this guy out there? Why isn't UD shooting? Why isn't Kaziak Pala out there? Because the Heat have a practice gym. It's alongside Biscayne Bay, where they hold their regular team practices also, and the guys go up there. Jimmy, who's just crazy, plays in those games also, and then plays his full 38 minutes during games also. So that's a little bit of the difference there. So you have that going on. You have sort of a pregame game, and then sometimes guys do find out at the last minute. But you know what? Udonis Haslem is this thing he calls where you have to get your body fired. And you'll see Udonis when we're on the road in the hallway going through an incredible workout to build that lather of sweat so he's ready to go also. And you know what? That's the lesson that the Michael Beasleys have to learn. You've heard this so much, it almost becomes cliche, but, be ready so you don't have to get ready.
Get ready. Right. And you hear that a lot with backup quarterbacks in the NFL too. Okay, final few minutes here. Bam Adebayo, he jammed the thumb the other night, and, hopefully that isn't something that's an additional concern. But you mentioned something last week for people who may not have been able to be with us on the show, that every day when he's questionable, or even during practices, but game days in particular, he'll go through the warm-up with Malik Allen, and then trainers will actually have to measure the swelling in his knee, to determine if he's able to play a game. So where does that stand? Is that something that is ongoing? Are there any plans, to your knowledge, to not... You mentioned this in the last, so I don't want to re-ask a question you already answered, but is there a point where you look at this and say, look, the swelling is not a good thing. We need to back off just so, he can get better, because it's not going to get better if he's going out there playing every single game.
I look at back-to-backs more than anything. So I know it's interesting, Clay, because we did our show last week on Friday because of the Thanksgiving schedule. That day, the Heat practiced in Chicago. That day, Eric Spoelstra told us on Saturday, for the first time, Bam was able to do his post-practice drilling, where he works with Malik Allen and Udonis Haslem, goes through 30 or 40 minutes of extra work. That was the first time in a long time. He said that Saturday. So maybe we are past that, and we are past the worst of it. To me, I still keep an eye on all these back-to-backs, because to me, that's where the real strain comes in. So again, by the time we talk next week, we'll know more about this. But I am curious, the back-to-back, Indiana on Friday, Milwaukee on Saturday. Yes, you don't want to lose to the Bucks. But a matter of fact, I would put it this way. The more likely concerning tiebreaker for the Heat at the end of the season probably will be Indiana than Milwaukee. I think Milwaukee's finding its legs. They are who they are. I think they'll be an elite 1 or 2 seed in the Eastern Conference. You don't want to get to that 4, 5, 6 thing and Indiana finds their legs. You've already lost your first game. to the Pacers this year. You don't want to wind up 0-2 in a head-to-head deficit. So I am curious. I think we'll get a little more window into the durability of the older players, Kyle Lowry, PJ Tucker, to a lesser extent, Jimmy Butler, but also into Bam's need to see how Eric Spoelstra manages this back-to-back. Now, in a perfect world, you have an easy enough victory tonight over Cleveland. Maybe you don't practice on Thursday, so there's not the strain on everyone. You play it out on Friday, you go to Milwaukee, you don't have the concerns. You're going to have Sunday off before coming home and playing Memphis next Monday. But I think that will be our window, Clay, into Bam's situation with his knee and how Eric Spoelstra is going to handle the older players also. To me, a back-to-back is always the best read. When they played last week and they played in Detroit and Minnesota, they went for it.
Yep.
Maybe that contributed to a little bit more of having issues, but they also had a 2-day break before that back-to-back and a 2-day break after that back-to-back. They don't have that again. That's not the case. So I would say keep an eye on Friday, Saturday. That might open a window into where they stand with Bam as well.
They did the same thing earlier this year when they played Charlotte on a Friday night. And then I was assuming, and I think you and I had actually talked about this, that we kind of figured that maybe one or both of Jimmy and Kyle would sit out.
Bam sat, yeah.
Yeah, Bam ended up sitting. I think it was because he actually had something with the knee.
That's when the whole knee started. It started when he took a knee to the knee in the Charlotte victory over the Hornets at home, yeah.
So they went for it there. They went for it last week. How much of this do you think is the NBA kind of cracking down on and saying, if you're going to rest guys, we understand don't do it on the road. The NBA has kind of made it clear they want the stars to play on the road because they want other teams' fans to be able to see opposing team stars in their building when they travel there for the 1 or 2 times a year.
More than that, they wanted our national television games. So as much as Heat fans might have groused about the lack of national TV games for the Heat, I think to a degree, Clay, that works in their favor also because the league's not getting mad. We put you on TNT, we put you on ESPN, you're not giving us your best product. So I think they escape that a little. They don't have a lot of national TV games. The ones they've had, they pretty much played it out as is. Doesn't count the NBA TV games like we saw on Monday when Tyler Hero and Jimmy Butler were out. So I think that helps them also. And I also think Pat Riley and Eric Spoelstra and Andy Ellisberg and Nick Arison and Adam Simon don't give a rat's butt about that. I think they are more concerned about their team's health. They will manage it how they see fit. The difference is, unlike the old days with Greg Popovich, they will announce it ahead of time. So maybe you see a whole bunch of guys listed as questionable on Friday, just so on Saturday, it's not a surprise when they pull into Milwaukee and give player X, Y, or Z a day off.
Let's bring it full circle here. We talked about this in the crossover and then at the top of the show, but Cavaliers coming up tonight, and it's a team that I think we all expected when you play the schedule game and schedule wins, schedule losses. This is one of those games that you were marking as a W before the year, and yet this is a much different team than I think any of us have expected. The guys to look out for, Evan Mobley is back, and this is a team that just went into Dallas and won. The only loss in the past few games, they lost at home to the defending Western Conference champs in Phoenix. I mean, this is a team that is playing well. It's not just that they're beating cupcakes on their set. They're playing well. What are you looking out for tonight, both from a Miami perspective so they can get right, guys like Duncan Robinson? What are you looking for specifically with Miami, but also how do they counter what Cleveland has done well to this point in the season?
I call these games scatter report games. When you have a day off, you have a unique opponent, a unique individual challenge that I think Eric Spoelstra is really going to sort of scout and go for counters. Okay, Jared Allen does this well, but he goes for blocks also. How do we mitigate them? How do we draw him out of the paint? Maybe we go with a smaller lineup. Larry Markkanen's not a great defender. How do we get him in cross matches and switches and things like that? Ricky Rubio pushes with the second unit. How do we mess up the younger player in Darius Garland with the starting unit? So I think this is a scatter report game. The Heat did not hold a full practice yesterday, but they went through their full preparations. They didn't have a shoot around today, again, because of the injuries. You need bodies to actually be on the court. But I think this is a film session game. And the one thing I think you'd agree with, Clay, Eric Spoelstra and his scouting staff and his video staff, when they get time to prepare for specifics, do a really good job. So I think you're going to watch this game and saying, oh, that's what they're doing against that guy. Oh, that's how they're trying to mess that guy up. I think this will be a scatter report game. I think this will be more of an IQ and mental game necessarily than if it was on the back-to-back or something like that.
And by the way, that's why you're confident in this team come playoff time that they're going to be better than they have been in the regular season. Is there does come a point in every series where it's just mano a mano, and you're talking about, hey, can one guy beat the other?
Right.
But there are also those very, very small adjustments that can become major things during the course of a short series, and that's what you're looking for if you're a Heat fan come playoff time. But for the regular season, it's a big game coming up tonight against Cleveland, and I don't know that we would have said it was a big game, but it certainly is. And then that back-to-back. And this is, again, Ira, we're kind of waiting for the schedule to soften up a little bit, and they're going to get more home games coming up.
Right.
This is one of those weeks where you can't take a breather. You can't take your foot off the gas, especially after you lost to Denver. So I'm looking for them to come out again, as they have against every Eastern Conference opponent they've played so far this year that's been kind of on the come up. I'm looking for them to come out and make a statement. I hope Jimmy can play. I hope Bam can play, because I think they're going to need him.
Yeah, and again, playoffs, you're healthy, you're fine. That's the thing. This team, when not whole, is not the same team. It's kind of basic. You're not healthy, you're just not as good a team. But tonight will be a test. I expect most, if not all, the guys on the injury report to play. I think Jimmy Butler's your biggest question mark.
And that is it for the Big O show today. Thank you guys for hanging out, both with us and with O. Before we tip things off right here, we will see you next week right here on Inside the Paint.
This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.